I know. Yeah. So you got to see it? Chicago. Oh, but still, oh, oh, okay. I got it. Oh, yeah, that we're standing up for a good reason.
Okay, everybody, we need to get going because get your coffee now because there's another group that's coming in at 11:30. So I need to basically shut up at 11 o'clock because then Father Katersky will do his half an hour lecture and then that should wrap it up at 11:30. So oh, 20. Well, then we'll see how far we can go. I originally had planned to go to 20, 21, 22, and 23, but we'll see, because at 11 o'clock I've got to stop talking. And the gag rule, there's going to be somebody else coming in. You want to find things, I get the story, but here's like good. Okay, I'm going to try to remember. It's all really good stuff. Karen, we got to get going. Karen, yeah, we need to get going because there's going to be another group that's going to come in. There's another group that's going to be coming in. Oh, page 39, chapter 20. Okay, we're just going to start with the Our Father. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Chapter 20, page 39. Does everybody have a book? If not, I've got more right here. Chapter 20. Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Now, you must understand that in the Middle East and many places around this world, good drinking water, potable water as they call it, is not available. In the Middle East, you have wells in certain places. Sometimes, as in Meribah, the wine was very brackish, and God helped Moses put something in it to make it drinkable. This is why in many countries, wine is served because the water is very bad. It can be polluted by wastewater, your bathroom water, going down into the soil and then merging with the drinking water. This was a very problematic in London many, many years ago. Not too far, just a couple of centuries or less, because, again, the water was getting polluted and people were dying of cholera. Cholera was a very prevalent disease that killed off many people in Europe and Asia with wastewater mixing with drinking water. And in London, what they did was basically found out people were dying, but which well were they getting their drinking water from, and they boarded those up and wouldn't let people in them. And then things got better. So this can even occur in a northern country like England. So that's why water, instead of being the meal for dinner, many times it's wine, because wine is at least 13% alcohol, and that's usually strong enough to kill off all the bacteria that is harmful to human beings. So that's why you have wine or something like that throughout the world due to bad drinking water. There's nothing evil in drinking wine. It's just drinking too much and drinking into excess. And that's why they say wine can be a strong drink, even things even stronger than wine. You get into obviously whiskeys and things like that. So anything in excess, it's saying, whether you can drink to excess, you can eat to excess, you can a lot of things one can do to excess, and you're going to suffer from it. That's the lesson there. Everything in moderation. Verse 5. The purpose of a man's mind is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. In other words, to understand something is one thing, but to be able to draw it out at certain times and apply it. That's what the Proverbs is really all about. It's wisdom that's being applied, or knowledge that is being applied equals wisdom. Down in the notes, they don't have it. Well, we'll move on. I thought there was going to be a note. No, there isn't one. Number 8, verse 8. A king who sits on the throne of judgment winnows all evil with his eyes. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Okay, down in the notes, winnows. Winnowing was a procedure used by farmers to separate grain kernels from the husk of chaff that enclosed them. This was done with a fork-like shovel on a threshing floor. Here, it serves as a metaphor for a king's ability to sift out perpetrators of evil from among his subjects. The idea is illustrated in the life of Solomon, who asked God for the wisdom to distinguish the guilty from the innocent in legal cases brought before him. And of course, you remember the story, I'm sure, about the 2 women. One at night rolled over and killed her child, and then she stole another woman's child and claimed it was hers. And it goes before Solomon, and he says, well, all right, we'll just cut this child in half. Well, the real mother, of course, objected, and therefore he gave that child to the real mother. That shows some of the, winnowing or separating out, the truth from the lies that you kind of have to go through in life. We all run into this. I don't know how many junk phone calls I get every day of somebody alleging that they're Amazon, and I owe them $999, and all they want is my Social Security number and my credit card number, date of birth, and my mother's maiden name. Now, this happens all the time, and you have to be careful. I gave kind of an exaggeration, but there are many people that are not honorable, that are not of service to you. They want to basically rip you off. Okay. Diverse weights and diverse measures are both alike, an abomination to the Lord. And down in the notes here, that's on number 10, 20:10, weights. Stones used as counterweights on a scale. And we've gone over this before, but the Hebrew refers to an ephah, a dry measure roughly equivalent to 2/3 of a bushel. Sellers could cheat the buyer by selling out grain in baskets that were smaller in volume than the standard size. And of course, they can cheat. In the old days, you had balances, and they would, cheat on the weights in order to get, the seller more money from you than they should have. 12, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Okay, the ear and the eye, this is where you see reality and learn and attain knowledge. You either hear it or see it. And the Lord has created both of these for our benefit to reach to the Lord. Many times there's the philosophy that you take a look at the intricacies of nature and the wonders and the marvels of how we are created, and even our ability to speak and see things. And this is, who can do this? It has to be God, because it can't be done by pure chance. Although some people would allege it could be, but Duhem, a French mathematician, pointed out that mathematically it's impossible. Mathematically it's impossible for us to be in this class right today with me with a microphone in front of me speaking to you, and you actually understanding what I'm saying. And, because we have to have the right amount of oxygen, the right temperature, and many other things that you pile all these things up, and mathematically it's impossible. And that, again, is an ancient proof for God. Okay, now, number 19 here. He who goes about gossiping reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with one who speaks foolishly. Well, these are not necessarily true secrets either. They could just be lies, and that's why you need to avoid people that always want to bend your ear about somebody else's failings in life. We all have them, and many times it's just the Lord giving us a trial in life to see. He's not going to do anything to you that you can't overcome. And so this is sort of like a purification of how much you can pain, how much ridicule you can put up with. 22 here. Do not say, I will repay evil. In other words, don't do any vengeance. Wait for the Lord, and he will help you. So you yourself should never be angry. If you're going to be angry with somebody, be angry with yourself for being angry. The Lord is going to take care, one way or the other, either in this life or the next one, all the other evildoers. And one of our problems, I think, in life is that we don't understand everything. Why is this happening to me? You just have to trust the Lord. That's all. Trust the Lord. And let's see, there's another one down here. Yeah, it says, I will repay. Exacting personal revenge is forbidden. Instead, one should entrust his non-criminal grievances to the justice of the Lord. And of course, the criminal ones, that's to the police and the judicial system. This is also the explicit teaching in the New Testament. And then 25. It is a snare for a man to say rashly, it is holy, and to reflect only after making his vows. Okay, what they're driving here is it's many times it's better never to make a vow than to make one and then break it. Especially with children, when you say you're going to do something for them and then you don't, they just are outraged. They're outraged with you for, you told me you were going to do this. You were going to take me to the park and you didn't do it. How could you do this? You know, and outraged. You know, children can get outraged, and along with many other of us, and we always resent those that make a vow or tell you, especially when politicians are always telling you that they're going to do one thing and then they wind up not doing it. I don't know how many times they always bring this big stuff up about, let's say, infrastructure. Every time, every presidential election. I think Eisenhower was the only one that ever did anything about it. But anyway, that's another story. 27, the spirit, this next page here on 40. 27, the spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all his innermost parts. So in other words, the Lord is looking at your spirit, not just your body, but what's inside of you, what makes you up. The note here on, let's see, where am I at here? 27. In the notes, spirit of man, the breath of life that comes from God, gives man a capacity for interior reflection and knowledge. That's one of the things at the end of each day you should be doing. I know I don't do it as well as I should, but reflect on each day, what you've done, whether it's good or bad, and if it's bad, learn from that. You know, learn from not only your mistakes, but others. And it's one good way of learning on in life is try not to make any mistake over and over again, because the results are not going to change. Number 30, blows that wound cleanse away evil. Strokes make clean the innermost parts. Now this is, a lot of people are going to take this the wrong way, like corporal punishment. It's not necessarily physical. I mean, what they're trying to get across really is training and learning not to do the same stupid thing again more than once. Okay, now down in the notes here, cleanse away evil. The moral benefit of corporal discipline, which helps to train the will in right behavior by turning it away from sin. The principle is applicable both to the discipline administered by parents and to the discipline of the Lord, who corrects his wayward children through various envisions discipline that is physical and that serves as a detriment for wrongful behavior, but it does not authorize actions that are abusive or injurious to children. The term wounding is used with rhetorical license and should not be taken literally. So in other words, when a child reaches or starts playing around with an electrical socket, you'll pull them away and maybe slap the hands or something like that. Or if it puts the hand on the stove and, again, you kind of pull it away and, no. There are several levels to morality. The lowest level is the taboo morality that, just don't do certain things. Don't put your hand on the stove because it might be on, it might be hot, you're going to hurt yourself. If you play around with an electrical outlet, you can get electrocuted. Kids sticking a fork into the outlet or something like that. So it's just, you telling them not to do certain things. And in various cultures around the world, that's about all there is in very primitive places that haven't been developed yet, where they have certain taboos that if you violate them, it's more than just a slap or a whip. Sometimes you lose body parts. Then the next level is the rational, the reason. You're thinking about why you should or shouldn't do things. Like, all right, I understand, Mommy, that I shouldn't put my hand, because young kids have to kind of reach up to the stove because I might burn my hand. Or the electrical outlet again, I can get seriously burnt that way too. Or don't run out in front of traffic, and because I can get hurt. And then there's the ethical level, the next step up, where you have people try to do the greatest good for the greatest number, something like that. And then finally you get to the moral or religious level, that you do not want to offend God because He loves you. And He will take care of your problems. Just trust the Lord. So you go from taboo, rational, ethical, and then religious. Chapter 21 now, verse 2. Every way of man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. In many parts of the Old Testament, especially when you get into the stories or the history, you'll run into that fact that instead of doing the Lord's will, people were trying to do what is right in their own eyes, and they wind up in trouble every time. And then there's a calamity, not only to them, but to the nation of Israel. It's when they come back to the Lord that salvation comes. And so it's a very familiar phrase, and any Jew would recognize it, about trying to do what is right in their own eyes. It does not work out. But the Lord weighs the heart. In other words, it's the inner character. And then the next one is a very, very underlined. You should underline this next line, number 3. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. In other words, the sacrifice of the lambs, that's one thing. But that's not really what the Lord wants. He wants righteousness and justice in your human heart. That's what He really wants. He doesn't want poor little lambs and goats. And I checked on my goat this morning, and he's alive and well in this bad weather. And I love Bo. But it's more important what is in your human heart than sacrifice. And that's an well-known line and should be underlined and always remembered and even memorized. The next note here, we're down there on number 3, more acceptable. Devotion to the Lord in love and obedience is valued higher than sacrificial offerings. The liturgical actions of the wicked are unacceptable because the sincerity of their worship is contradicted by the sinfulness of their works. And a lot of times the writings here will use the word lamp, like number 4 here, haughty eyes and a proud heart. The lamp of the wicked are, in other words, instead of the word lamp, just put in the word deeds. The deeds of the wicked are sin. And there are many times in the Old Testament where somebody's going to put a lamp or under a bed or something like that, but they're really talking about somebody's deeds, whether they're good or bad. Number 13. He who closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself cry out and not be heard. A lot of times, what you do in life is you develop maybe a reputation by helping out other people. And in your own time, good things happen. Not that I'm a great Catholic or my wife, but I've had more people come up to me that I don't even know who they are that tell me that they're praying for my wife and children. And that's good. That really touches me. And I think you've all probably been touched with people that kind of go out of their way to help you out in your time of need. Now, down in the verses here, the cry of the poor. Concern for those in need is expressed several times in Proverbs. Here, giving help to the poor and underprivileged is a condition for receiving similar treatment in return. The merciless can expect no mercy from the Lord in their own time of need. And then a note here, poverty is crueler than the beast of prey. You must aid its victims and give ear to their cry. This is 21:13, the cry of the poor. And then there's a little dot here, and it says, poverty is crueler than a beast of prey. You must aid its victims and give ear to their cry. Give that you may receive, and hear that you may be heard. Almsgiving and charity crown us with the glory of God and bring us to the undying happiness that Christ gives to those who love him. Now, I know when I was much younger, I didn't really have much money at all. Cheryl and I were just getting by, just barely. So I really couldn't help out the poor. But what I did was join the St. Vincent Paul Society. Matt here, I know, was also a member. And this is one time, prayer is important. That's one way of doing it. And then, donating it, money to charity. And then sometimes just being active in something, whether it's in the Knights of Columbus or the other similar type of organizations that will help out other people. You can do it that way. That's what I did anyway. And I was always amazed. People would give me money, they would give me food, all sorts of things to help out those people. And an organization like St. Vincent de Paul, in our parish anyway, the main goal is to keep people in a house or an apartment and not have them wind up out on the street. And with me, it was also an opportunity to evangelize. I know we were always supposed to do that, but I did it that way. And I think, and I think people respected that. I know I used to give out also a gospel of St. Mark, and then occasionally somebody would say, do you have something other than St. Mark? I already got that one. So yes. And so I know people were actually reading some of the material in the books that I was handing out as well. Okay, number 22. A wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the stronghold which they trust. Okay, in the notes here, 20:21:22. The stronghold represents the intellectual arguments and defenses that godless men raise in opposition to the Lord. Armed with a knowledge of truth, those who are wise can expose godless skepticism as unfounded and undermine confidence in worldly ways of thinking. The lesson in general terms is that wisdom prevails over power. Okay, the one example, and I've gone through this several times with skeptics. Sometimes people make the mistake of going after me, and they'll say something like, there is no absolute truth. And I say, wait a minute, let's examine that statement in itself. Are you saying, doesn't that statement, there is no absolute truth, aren't you saying that that is an absolute truth and therefore it's contradicting everything you're saying? Think about it. If you say there is no absolute truth, well, that statement in itself is contradicting. It's contrary. It's contradictory. And that was an argument when, I would say that God is absolute truth. And of course, imagine immediately they pounced, but then they were rebuffed. And then they would leave me alone. Simple as that. Then number 24. Scoffer is the name of the proud, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. The desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. And this is in 20, well, they don't really have anything in the notes here on this one. But many times, this is one of the reasons I don't watch television news, Scoffer is the name of a proud, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride, and they're usually putting down somebody else, and trying to. You'll see this in a lot of people that in order to build themselves up, they think they're going to put somebody else down. And the desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. In other words, they're just parroting some talking point, and they're not really going out and doing the investigative research that should be done. I think we all kind of hear a lot of folk tales and city, types of nonsense, only because you know it's wrong, because you've had experience and knowledge of something, or else you've flat out seen things that were not so. Okay, 31. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. In other words, a lot of times something goes right for you in life, but don't take credit for it. It was probably the Lord helping you out. Okay, 31 in the notes here. 21:31, the victory. The proverb acknowledges the primacy of God's grace in the life of the people. Whatever success comes from their efforts, it is thanks to the Lord and the help that He provides. Even the current job that I've had for 32 years, I think was an act of God. I had a miserable time in a previous job, and I decided I couldn't take it any longer, and something else much better came along. And the Lord kind of bailed me out, and I think that's probably happened to a lot of us in life, where something good has happened, whether it's a good marriage that's last forever, or a good job that may not pay the greatest, but they're good people to work with, and you feel you're doing good service. That's important in a job. You shouldn't think necessarily about the wage, although that's important, but are you doing a service to other people? And in my way of thinking, even where I shop, even the lady that does the bagging of my groceries is a big service to me. And of course, there's my pharmacist, my cardiologist, and all the people in his office, the arthritis doctor, and all the people in her office, and my primary care doctor, and on and on it goes. And I pray for every one of them. Okay, verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. There used to be the old phrase, I think it was about the Jesuits, that if the Jesuit has a child for the first 7 years of their lives, they'll have them forever. That was kind of an old phrase, not necessarily true, but early childhood is very important in how a child is going to turn out. And down in the notes here, 22:6, train up a child. Parental instruction and discipline help to impart life lessons to the children that can stay with them into adult. And that's even how to handle money and things like that are important in getting a foothold in developing a family. There are a lot of people that are just reckless when it comes to money and spending it on, lotto tickets and things like that that are not going to help them out. And that comes up here in number 7. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. In other words, never get into too much debt. The borrower is a slave, down here in the notes, 22:7. An observational proverb that warns against incurring debt irresponsibly and unnecessarily. In the biblical world, one should literally become a slave to his creditor until the balance of what he owed was paid off. In other words, if you get into a debt situation, do whatever it takes to get out of it. I know with my own father, he had just a man with tremendous stamina. He would literally, he had a regular job, kind of work the swing shift. He would get off and sweep out the parking lot of a Dick's drive-in, and then in the morning, sometimes he was a substitute mail carrier, and he would do that as well. I think many times he would only get like about 6 hours of sleep at the most, but he would do this year after year to get my sisters and my brother through college, or some other expense that would come up. And so there are ways. Sometimes it's taking on that extra job or just cutting back. There's a man on the radio called Dave Ramsey that has some good advice on how to manage your money in the household. Turning the page on page 42. Again, there's this 15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. And what they're not, this rod of discipline is actually just training. That's what it means, training. The rod in the Old Testament, you think of Moses and his staff, and the rod of Aaron. Aaron was the starting of the priesthood, and Aaron was Moses' brother. Or anyway, they were related. I can't remember exactly how, but Aaron also was the spokesperson for Moses, because Moses, had a stammer and a stutter and had a speech impediment. And in our worship chapel and for adoration, there's a statue of Joseph, Mary's husband. And you notice there's the staff that he has with flowers growing out of it. And again, that's important. In old readings or stories about the Bible, that was why Joseph was chosen to be Mary's husband, was that miracles were happening to him. He was a very saintly person. And so there's these rods and staffs kind of throughout the Old Testament and the New. And one, it has to do with training, but also good character and saintliness. Okay, now, 17, incline your ear and hear the words of the wise and apply your mind to my knowledge. Okay, now I'm going to read this. It goes 22:17 all the way through 24:34 in the notes here. 2 collections of saying introduced by headings and so forth. And many scholars detected parallels between this section of Proverbs and the ancient Egyptian work of the instructions of Amenemope. This work, predating the Israelite monarchy and arranged into 30 chapters in an ensemble of fatherly maxims on how to live a successful life. As many as 20 passages may be inspired by the sayings that appear in this Egyptian composition. So in other words, what they're showing here is that Solomon brought in other teachings from around the Middle East and maybe even further. And so it's what we're dealing here is just not everything written by Solomon. Some of it was, but then there's also collections from other areas, and it's kind of admitted here. Later on, there's actually going to be some authors that are going to be mentioned by name as we get into some of the later chapters. Lemuel is one, and Agri is another. So these teachings were just not necessarily just confined to the Jews, but to others, and that means to us as well. These are long-term teachings that are just not for the Old Testament, but for us living today as well, for many different people. 22, do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. And it says here at the gate, 22:22. The main entrance to a walled town served as a public forum where legal cases and business transactions were handled by a council of elders. Later on, we'll get to this, again, coming back to the gate, because when you get into the last chapter and they're talking about the ideal wife, she is so respected that she can do business at the gate. In other words, it's just so well thought of by other people. The reputation, character counts. It's more important than, beauty is just skin deep, but character will carry you a lot further. 24, make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. So in other words, don't ever control your temper. Recognize that in yourself, because whenever you are getting involved with anger, you're drawing yourself away from God. Remember of the 7 deadly sins, one of them is anger. Usually pride, anger, lust, envy. And then there's gluttony, avarice, which is like stinginess, and then sloth. And I know I have problems with gluttony and sloth myself. We all have some certain problems in life. And moving down to 23 here, chapter 23, verse 4. Do not toil to acquire wealth. Be wise enough to desist. In other words, do what you can do well in life. And don't focus in on power. A lot of people also, I've got to grow in this job or something like that. And I usually say, listen, I've been at this job for 32 years, and if anything, I've shrunk a little bit. I haven't grown. I used to be 6'2", and now I'm 6 foot, and probably shrinking from that. But as far as growth, yeah, there's more belly fat on me, But don't focus, just focus on being of service to other people or to your clients, whoever they are, in whatever situation you're working at. Successful will come from that. When you are of good service to others, you will be recognized and you will be promoted. But if you're strictly focusing on power and lose that touch with the people that you're supposed to serve, you're going to be asked to leave. It's good way to get run out of a job is not, to basically ignore the little things and the people that you're supposed to be being of service to. So never focus in just on, I got to be wealthy. It's not going to work that way. I think my son-in-law pointed out from some study that he had read that it's the people that actually don't focus in on wealth or power that become wealthy and powerful, because they are taking care of those people that they need to take care of. Now, a next difficult line here, I kind of skipped over it. Let's start at the beginning of 23. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you were a man given to appetite. Well, what does all that mean? In the notes here, knife to your throat, an image of self-restraint, which is recommended for one who struggles with overeating. In this case, the virtue of temperance promotes proper table manners, which is all more important than dining with a person of importance. In business, there's a lot of times when you're going to be going out and having a dinner with an associate or somebody from some other company. And believe me, it's very important to have good table manners. In fact, where I've worked in the past once, connections with other cities and so forth was really important. And in the interview process, well, let's go out to have lunch. And what they're really looking for is how well and how good your table manners are. And if you're a total slob just gulping down food, you're not going to get hired. Because, well, you could be overly hungry, but the people doing the hiring, and I was one of them, look carefully at how the person is conducting themselves. It's even just eating a meal. In my job at the treatment plant, a lot of times I will look at a person's hands. Do they look like somebody that's done really heavy, hard work, or are they lily white? And because where the people that I supervise, they're doing hard work and they're using their hands, and somebody with just really clean, there's not even a gouge on their hands, no death lines or anything, tell me that they're not really good at working with their hands. It's one of those little things that you kind of pick up on, but can this person do the work that you really need to have done? Okay, so don't focus in on power or wealth. If you do, it's a waste of time. And eventually it will allow you just to get frustrated in a job and miss out on all the joys of being able to help out other people. As I'm running short of time here, let's just jump on over to number 29. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine, do not look at wine when it is red, when it is sparkles up in the cup and goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind utter perverse things. You will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, one who lies on the top of a mast. And now I'm going to read here 23, and it goes from 29 to 35 in the notes. The folly of drunkenness is vividly depicted. Among its painful consequences, it causes sorrow and strife, produces strange and embarrassing behavior, and can even lead to poverty. No less tragically, the drunkard becomes a slave to his alcohol, for no sooner does he recover from his intoxication than his heart desires another drink. And then further down here in 31, do not look at wine, an enticement to the alcoholic. In the Greek Septuagint reads instead, Do not get drunk with wine. It is quoted by Paul. Be not friends with someone who will make you displeasing to God. Such a one is an enemy both to himself and to you. Now, this tragedy about alcoholism is one thing, but in the modern day situations, to give you an example, personal example, I had a supervisor that smoked marijuana, inhaled and exhaled, and inhaled and exhaled. The problem with that is that you cannot do chemistry work because you need to have a good steady hand and able to, be very dexterous. He couldn't do it when he was high, and he was always giving me his work to do for him if it involved any sophisticated work. Well, in an economic downturn, who got let go? Was it my supervisor or me? No, he was the one that was let go. Because eventually I think somebody realized that this guy could not carry on, day-to-day work where I could. So there's a problem of young people get involved in drugs, and they're going to basically be eliminating themselves in a lot of jobs and a good career path in life because people know. I mean, do you have a good steady hand? Are you reliable? Can you speak well? Another example I had once was when I was very young. I was walking up 10th, and some guys picked me up, and they were friends. The guy, one of them was a friend of mine. They pulled me over, and I got in the car and went right through a red light, and by the time we got up to Roy there on Capitol Hill, I said, let me out, I got to get out. And my friend Paul was saying, Duke, you don't live right here. I says, I got something to do, let me out. And so I got out, and then they left. And the next day, Paul comes bounding down the hallway, and, Duke, how did you know? How did you know? I says, what? And he says, well, we got in an accident when we got up to John. And I says, well, that doesn't surprise me. The guy that was driving the car was obviously dabbling in weed because he had driven right through a red light, and I could smell this acrid smell in the car that told me that this is a situation where I should not be involved in. In other words, avoid the near occasions of sin. And fortunately, in the accident, the car would have come in right against the side of the car where I was seated. So God looked out for me there and taught me that stay away from bad situations. That brings us up to number 24, and I will stop speaking now, and it's time for the video. And be prepared always. Yes. Yes. Just a minute. Hold it. Just a minute. You're getting into something that's very important, and I don't know if we can be able to pick this up, but I want you to start all over again and tell me about your son and the people that he has to work with and how they're sharp they are.
Oh, okay. He just started. He's a consultant. He works in one of the big companies, and they go in groups to work with a company to get whether they can do what they want to do, or and they give them advice, and it's usually like 5 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks since he's just starting, and they do this part of a training program working with people, and it's really most of the things that Duke brought up today are, it fits in, you know, how you present yourself. They have dinners and getting together, and they do have a glass of wine or you know, but they're all very conscious of keeping themselves in good health and communicating and doing their job. They stick to their job, and I just thought it fit right in with what's it. It's important how we look and doing. If you see somebody that needs something, you help them out or you work with them, and so it's good.
Just hold on.
The employers are looking at prospective employees, and even employees that they have, they're looking at their social media. And if you got somebody that does well on the job, but he puts a post on Facebook and he's dancing on the table with the lampshade on his head, you know, it doesn't speak well, especially somebody trying to get a job. If he's got a bunch of nonsense on this social media, probably won't get it. So it's not just on the job, it's around the clock.
Thank you. Yes, number 7.
Thus far, we have been considering the biblical wisdom tradition by looking at the book of Proverbs and a psalm. This lecture will offer an overview of a second important stream of thought within biblical wisdom literature. In books like Job and Koheleth, we find a different, or rather philosophical approach that highly focuses on the problem of innocent suffering, an approach that is sometimes quite skeptical in its questioning. This lecture will provide a general orientation to the book of Job as a distinctively biblical way to pursue wisdom. It's a part of an ongoing discussion. We'll begin our study of the text of this book by looking at the book structure and making a suggestion about a choice of translation. It'll be important to keep in mind right from the start that this is a masterful wisdom story that has interesting twists and turns. It shows Job's faith in God while struggling to endure great sufferings. Let's consider then the question about approaching wisdom by way of philosophy, by way of questions, as well as by way of dramatic stories, and even by way of liturgy. We noticed as ready in what we've seen in this course that one way to pursue wisdom is through exhortation, through the quotation of Proverbs, through dramatic stories like those first 9 chapters of Proverbs. That's a way to wisdom. The wisdom teaching that's in Proverbs constantly exhorts us to consider the good sense that anyone, whether a believer or not, ought to recognize in the pattern of life that is commanded in the Decalogue. One could take them as versions of the Golden Rule in a way. It encourages us by the promise that divine providence will see to it that the righteous will prosper and that the punishment will come to the wicked. What brings us to this second stream of thought is the difficulty, the question that arises: what about when it just doesn't seem to work out that way? Are we simply to reject the perspective of Proverbs as false? Or does the perspective of Proverbs mean something else? Is there more to say on the question from some other point of view? This question is very pressing, not only as the result of our personal experience, but from the open criticism that is found in some of the scholarly literature that sometimes is directed even against the biblical perspective. There is a second important strand then in biblical wisdom literature, a strand that is especially associated with the book of Job and with the book of Koheleth. They raise these philosophical questions about the incongruities of life. But in doing so, they seem to me to confirm the interpretation that I was trying to provide of Proverbs, namely that Proverbs is intended as exhortation. Proverbs is not intended as direct prophecy of what's going to happen in an individual's future. They're not intended directly as a prediction about how things are going to turn out in the short run. Rather, exhortation, which I think is crucial to understanding Proverbs, exhortation is encouragement, not a revelation about a specific course of one's life. Taking as its starting point the figure of Job, a good man who is faced with senseless suffering, something he cannot understand, the book of Job offers a distinctive path toward wisdom. We'll consider a different path toward wisdom, still in this philosophical dimension, when we turn to Koheleth in Lecture 15. What we have to consider for Job seems to me to be drama, that this book is written in the genre of the dramatic, and that the dramatic, the setting of characters on a stage and setting them into action, that too can be a way to pursue wisdom. Given that Job involves so much of drama, it is no surprise that over the years, creative artists like William Blake, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Archibald MacLeish, Karl Wojtyła, the later Pope John Paul II, have turned to this biblical book for inspiration of a dramatic nature. The 21 illustrations of William Blake, figure lived from 1757 to 1827, 21 illustrations that he made of the book of Job present a very beautiful, but admittedly idiosyncratic picture. What these illustrations do is to try to lead the viewer through an education in suffering that's somewhat parallel to that of Job. There are some interesting versions of that available even now in print. Secondly, between 1927 and 1930, Ralph Vaughan Williams, the tremendous British composer who lived until the year 1958, he composed a ballet that was called Job, a Mask for Dancing. It has 9 scenes, and interestingly, his choice of 9 scenes from the longer text of the biblical book of Job are designed to illustrate the vision that William Blake had created in his paintings. Vaughan Williams's version, of course, communicates the emotional drama of Job, the way in which he is so deeply perplexed within himself. And it does so in the haunting music symbols and the dance choreography. It says by the action of the ballet dancers what sometimes the text tries to convey by its words. The American poet Archibald MacLeish, who lived until the year 1982, he too wrote a play. His version is called J.B. from the year 1958. And he sets the story of Job, interestingly, in a circus, a modern circus. What is distinctive, I find, in his version, is the interesting identification of those 3 friends of Job who try to comfort him. He identifies them very explicitly with history, with science, and with religion. And so the way in which he pictures those 3 friends is that they're offering mutually incompatible explanation for Job's sufferings, all of which Job rejects while he's maintaining his innocence. Now, in my vision, those 3 friends aren't maintaining incompatible perspectives. I see them actually as far more deeply together. But in MacLeish's version, they're incompatible, and Job is forced to reject all of them. Eventually, what happens in the play J.B. is that he maintains his innocence, and he goes off deciding to create a new way of life, together with his wife, Sarah. It may be significant that this is an American poet who's doing it, because he shows perhaps a typically American sense of resilience as the answer to suffering. If it doesn't work out here, let's go out west and try it somewhere else and do it again. Finally, I wanted to suggest to you an interesting dramatic presentation of this by Karl Wojtyła, the man who later became Pope John Paul II, passed away just in the year 2005. In the year 1940, before he had even entered the seminary, he was deeply involved in drama, and he wrote a play called Job. His version strikes me as very much more like Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, as you know, there are long speeches, and very little interaction among the characters. The Greek theater doesn't have anywhere nearly the amount of coming and going that our modern drama tends to have, but instead action is described orally. Action is recounted by what the characters say, and that's how Wojtyła has the character of Job shown. Not surprisingly, he connects the suffering of Job with the suffering of Christ. But also, and not surprising given the author, he connects it with the Polish people who had, at that point, suffered invasion by the Russians and by the Nazis. All of them are quite interesting. I mention them here simply to suggest these artists have seen the dramatic possibilities of Job, and so too must we when we're looking at this text. Let me just offer a caution here as we attempt to interpret this in line with drama. Namely, that in studying a drama, there is a need here to respect the biblical character of this and to respect the drama. Precisely out of respect for the Bible as the Word of God, we, whether we are Jews or Christians or believers of a particular denomination, we might find ourselves in the position of wanting to say, I want to say it, that every line in a book of biblical revelation is a part of that revelation, that every line is intended for our salvation. Well, one way to interpret that basic position would be to hold that every single line simply and directly manifests God's views, period. The problem with that viewpoint, however, is that the meaning of some individual sentences stand in direct opposition to the meaning of other sentences. And so if God is saying both of them and intending both of them in the same sense, God is contradicting himself. But there are other ways, reliable ways, to handle the problem. If we agree that the book of Job is a kind of theatrical drama, it may be that the meaning of the book of Job and the divine message of the book comes from the action of the book as a whole, rather than from any particular line. To take note of this is still to hold that every line of the book is part of revelation, but that sometimes what God is disclosing by revelation is not his own exhortation to us, but rather what God is disclosing is an accurate account of a position that is contrary to divine providence. Human authors do that all the time. To neglect that perspective, to neglect the dramatic element, even as a vehicle for revelation, runs the risk of committing what literary scholars sometimes call the dramatic fallacy. That is, the mistake of presuming that what a given character says is what the author means. To take another example, would we want to say that the character Othello in the play by Shakespeare, that what that character Othello says, or what Desdemona says, or what Iago says, is Shakespeare's point of view just because Shakespeare wrote the lines? Of course not. The message comes from the action of the whole play, and not from any one character's words at any one point in the play. That would be to make the mistake of taking something out of context, a dramatic context, and presuming that therefore we understood what Shakespeare meant. Something of the same character, I think, will be true of the book of Job, where we have speeches in a dramatic setting, the whole thing, I would want to say, the result of divine inspiration, but nonetheless dramatic in the way it presents that inspiration. Over the years, the book has been carefully read by many scholars in various traditions. It has inspired countless theologians and philosophers, as well as the artists that I mentioned just a moment ago. Let me cite one of those authors of a philosophical character whom I much admire and from whom I have learned much in the course of my studies, the 12th century Rabbi Maimonides. He discusses the book of Job in his Guide for the Perplexed. You'll find it especially in chapters 22 and 23 of that book. When Maimonides is reflecting on this problem, very mindful of the sufferings of his people and the experience of human suffering at any time, Maimonides is looking for where the voice of God is and where the message of divine revelation is. He takes each of the friends of Job, we'll be discussing them in just a few minutes, he takes each of the friends of Job to represent a distinct school of thought on the question of God and divine providence. This had been so long discussed in rabbinical literature. Bildad, for instance, one of the figures, one of the friends of Job, seems to Maimonides to stand for the view that righteousness will be rewarded by God, even if one needs to be patient in waiting for the eventual reward. So Bildad turns out to be kind of a patron saint of patience. For Maimonides, it turns out to be the figure of Elihu, who shows up around chapter 33, the figure of Elihu who has the right point of view of divine providence. In chapter 33 of Job, Elihu explains that what we have to understand here is God's point of view. And so Maimonides says, this is to take the point of view of an examined religion as what is worthy of belief, not some unexamined position, and that the unquestioning piety that the character Job presents at the start of the book needs to be submitted to questioning if his religion is to be deepened. Maimonides is suggesting then that the three friends start the process of questioning, and that Elihu's pressing question, this is what it means to have an examined religion. It is not, according to Maimonides, it is not that God singled Job out for punishment, so much as that he abandoned Job to the unfriendly forces of nature and then to the more friendly forces of his friends in order to get Job to have his religion challenged and to make his religion a more genuine part of his life in a philosophically examined way. In addition to those philosophical and theological points of view and the artistic points of view, it's interesting to consider for a moment the liturgical use of the book of Job. While the book of Job is not read publicly in most traditions of Jewish liturgy that I know about, in the way that the Torah is read and the prophets are read, there are some Jewish groups, especially in the Sephardic tradition, that is, those of Spanish, Portuguese origin, that do read from the book of Job on the 9th of Av as part of their fast and their mourning over the tragedy of the destruction of the first and second temple. In that case, they find a way to include it in their liturgy. Likewise, the Orthodox Church, during Holy Week, reads from the book of Job as well as from the book of Exodus on the understanding that Exodus, the account of Israel's Passover, its liberation from Egyptian slavery, is a preparation for understanding Christ's Passover. They read the book of Job at the same time, understanding the suffering of Job as a kind of an Old Testament icon, an Old Testament symbol of Christ entering into the suffering that culminates in his Passover and in his Passion. Roman Catholicism, my own tradition, has traditionally read from the book of Job in our Office of Readings, specifically during Matins in the first 2 weeks of September. That Office of Readings was revised about 30 years ago, and in the revised version of the Liturgy of Hours that is now in use, the book of Job is read during the 8th and 9th weeks of Ordinary Time. It comes up in midsummer, and thus within a series of readings that we are doing at that time of year, all from the Bible's sapiential books. Let's turn our attention now to the book of Job itself. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at its text and its structure as a way to help your reading and help our mutual understanding of this material. First, we should consider the choice of a translation, as well as the structure of the book and perhaps a few notes on the origins of it. As we noted when we were discussing Proverbs, there are many wonderful translations of the Bible available, and I encourage using several of them in order to see the difference and to see the points of emphasis. There may be some differences that you will note here in the book of Job from one translation to the next, and those are not simply the preferences of the translator, but they are the technical difficulties that occur because of the actual textual status of the Hebrew text of Job. Many translators are forced to make their best judgments about what the word means or how the phrase should be rendered or even where the phrase belongs within the flow. And hence, you'll find in some versions that the numbering is going to differ a little bit from the numbering that I will be using. Because of the dramatic nature of the book and the way in which this is so significant, I've chosen to use the what I consider to be the most reliable of modern English translations. It's called the Revised Standard Version, and they try to stay very, very close to the text, even while getting a readable translation. Whatever translation you use, please be sure to note the juxtaposition of prose and poetry. The first 2 chapters of the book are in prose, and they set the scene. I think what we're supposed to be hearing by the use of prose is that a story is being told. But then, from chapter 3 all the way through into chapter 42, first 6 verses, we'll find this to be in poetry, in verse. Finally, at the very tail end, beginning at verse 7 of chapter 42, we return in the epilogue to prose and the resolution of Job's troubles by the restoration of his fortunes. In a way, the story that was begun at the beginning is now being completed, but what was occurring in the middle was the drama we were supposed to watch. On the basis of other references to the character Job that are found within Scripture, for example, there's reference to him in the book of the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 14 in a couple of places. Most of the Talmudic discussion within Judaism presumes Job to have been an actual historical person. Perhaps he was one of the 3 advisors whom Pharaoh consulted before taking action against what Pharaoh considered to be the increasingly numerous children of Israel. There's a discussion of this, for instance, in the tractate Sotah within the Talmud. But there's a minority position as well among rabbinical scholars, and the minority position takes the figure of Job to be a literary creation, something that is purely concocted, created by the author, whose name we do not know, to tell a wisdom story. Interestingly, the very first of Job's friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, he too could be identifiable in terms of Genesis chapter 36, 11 to 12. The Talmudic tractate Bava Basra, it's at number 15, A and B, if you want to follow it. This Talmudic tractate regards Moses as the author of the book. Perhaps. Modern scholarship is quite divided on the question of the author and on the date of the book's origins. Some parts of modern scholarship date it from the time of David and Solomon, about the year 1000 to about the year 930 BC. Others have taken it to come from a later time, the time of the exile, so sometime between 721 and 539. To my mind, there is some good reasoning here in thinking that the later date from the time of the exile may be right. What I'm thinking of is simply that it so much focuses on the problem of suffering. Not that there wasn't suffering before, there's always suffering, but because of the enormous suffering that that exile produced, that this could very well be a biblical effort to reflect on that suffering. Let's turn, though, to the question of the structure of the book, and we'll be spending much of the subsequent lectures using the structure that we talk about now. The structure reveals much about the perspective that I'm taking in this lecture, and I think much about the nature of the book. The opening 2 chapters recount the story of Job as a faithful servant of God, whose very fidelity Satan, his name means the accuser, whose fidelity Satan is permitted to test by causing the loss of Job's possessions, the loss of his servants, even the loss of his children, the loss of his health. That's described from the beginning of the book up through the 10th chapter, to the 10th verse of the 2nd chapter. The scandalous idea that God might somehow be responsible for Job's suffering is thus broached right at the beginning of the book. As we will see later, this is one way in which to suggest the idea that in leaving human beings free to make their choices about life and what life brings, God does allow suffering. 3 of Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, decide to sit with him, and they will try to console him during his afflictions. It's a version of the traditional Jewish practice called sitting Shiva. As we proceed, we will find it, I think, very useful to ponder the place of silent compassion, as well as the role of comforting speech, when we ourselves are considering how to accompany someone in suffering. Sometimes the best thing is to talk and to talk freely. Sometimes the best thing is to sit there in compassion without a lot of conversation, but allow one's own presence to make the difference. The text here provides an example of a practice that various religious communities often recommend, and they do some of both. They sit with him in silence for 7 days before the conversation begins. Job complains of his afflictions, and he curses the day of his birth. One might ask, what good does that do? Although I suspect that what it is that he is unwilling to curse God, and so instead he curses the day he was born. When Job's friends start to talk, what they do is they begin to urge him to just admit that there must be some guilt in his heart. There must be some sin that has brought on this misfortune. Job, however, steadfastly insists on his innocence. And if he has a demand, his demand is to have his day in court. He wants to have a trial that he can prove his innocence. The emotions of Job here in this opening section, chapter 3, are quite raw. And it is important, I think, to appreciate the outpouring of grief. Even though he is a devout man, he does not assume that his suffering is going to end anytime soon. He does not think that it's unimportant. He thinks it's important that he's having to suffer. He does not think that it's illusory. This is portrayed by the text as real grief. This is the beginning of the setting of the stage for the drama that we're about to witness. These conversations that take place then, they will occur in 3 cycles. We'll study the cycles more in detail in the next few lectures, but I'd like to comment in a general way on it here. In each of these cycles, one of his friends speaks and Job replies. A friend speaks and Job replies. A friend speaks and Job replies. Since there are 3 friends, we hear what each of the friends have to say, and then a reply by Job. The give and take of the conversation goes on through the first cycle. It's repeated in the second cycle, but then it breaks down in the third cycle. That is, the first friend has his chance to speak, Job replies. The second friend begins to speak, but he can't even imagine another way to try to convince Job of the same point. I would like to suggest that even that interruption of the narrative has a special significance for the point of the book. If you're trying to follow it, the first cycle goes from chapter 4 through chapter 14, the second cycle from chapter 15 through chapter 21, and the third cycle begins in chapter 22 and goes up into chapter 27. Just before Job's concluding speech, which starts at chapter 29, there is a wisdom poem that is found in chapter 28. This wisdom poem is akin, in some important respects, to something we've already studied, namely Proverbs chapter 8. We had a special consideration of the wisdom poem there, which sort of breaks away from the narrative in the book of Proverbs. Well, so too here in the book of Job, chapter 28 breaks away from the drama for a minute. When we study this material, we'll see some of the important connections between one book of the Bible and another portion of biblical wisdom literature. The text continues, however, with a trial scene, the thing that Job has been wanting, but not quite the way he wanted it. A young man, Elihu, arrives, and he's going to hear Job's case. After listening to Job's testimony, Elihu pronounces in favor of divine justice. That's chapters 32 to 37. This is the scene that Maimonides found so compelling, in which he thought he saw the right perspective on divine providence. But then, beginning in chapter 38, God himself unexpectedly appears. He appears in a whirlwind. He proclaims the divine sovereignty will not be judged by anybody. Job immediately concedes God's superior wisdom. It's the master of all nature. I would presume that seeing this material as the climax gives us yet a different perspective on it, and we'll deal with that in a subsequent lecture. God vindicates his servant Job. Job retracts his demand for a trial. We can't put God on trial. At the Lord's directives, Job then has to get down on his knees and plead for his friends. And God restores what Job has lost. That's the epilogue that returns to prose beginning at chapter 42, verse 7. Admittedly, there is a bit of a problem here, a problem that scholars have noticed, because a happy ending is not quite what we would have expected from the rest of the text. When the time comes in the course of our lectures, we'll return to that problem. But let me invite you to read the opening chapters of this masterpiece of a story. If the opportunity presents itself for you, you might find it helpful to read this book aloud with somebody taking the part of the narrator, somebody taking the part of Job, and then various people taking the part of the three friends, and so on. Hearing it read with different voices could well make it clearer how this is unfolding as a drama. I've done that myself with groups and have found that extremely interesting. We might also just ask ourselves a little bit about what the characters stand for. And one of the questions I would pose to you as you're undertaking your reading of this is a question of the role of God. He shows up only in the very beginning and then not until the chapters in the 30s. And what is this role and what is his perspective in allowing so much suffering to happen? What is the character of Satan? We'll look a little bit at that in the next lecture. And then, do the three friends of Job have distinct perspectives, or are they all in the same perspective? I would hope that those questions will help to make your own reading of this yet more enlightening and more comprehensive. The purpose of this lecture will be to enter more deeply into the book of Job by looking at its first 7 chapters. We will consider first the problem that is raised by the setting of the book, namely within the courts of heaven. In the next few chapters, we will encounter Job sitting and then